So yesterday we started talking about gas exchange in humans, and why is it important for there to be gas exchange, the requirement for oxygen, and the need to remove carbon dioxide from the body, from the blood. We looked at the structure of the the lungs, which include the lungs themselves and the ribs, the intercostal muscles, and the diaphragm. Then parts of the breathing apparatus, the larynx, which leads into the trachea, which splits into the bronchi, which further splits into bronchioles and then ends in air sacs, thin-walled air sacs called alveoli. Right, and there are 350 million alveoli in total, which give a surface area of about 90 meters square, which is equivalent to a tennis court. Right. We also looked at how the lungs are specialized to give maximum efficiency for gas exchange. So there's a very good blood supply around the alveoli, right, for efficient gas exchange. We looked at the percentages of the components of the inspired and expired air. We talked about ventilation, which is the constant breathing in and breathing out, right? Therefore, replenishing the supply of oxygen and removing carbon dioxide. Obviously, the surface area and the thinness of the epithelium of the alveoli, and obviously the single-celled walls of the capillaries also help in increasing the efficiency of diffusion. Then, right, we talked about the epiglottis, which covers the larynx during swallowing so that food or water does not enter into the lungs, it just goes into the esophagus. The rib cage is there, those are the bones surrounding the chest, and they protect the heart and lungs and move to ventilate the lungs. Right, answering your query, we talked about arteries forming arterioles, capillaries, then going back to venules and veins. And then we talked about breathing rate and lung capacity. The maximum lung capacity is 5 liters. Normally there's a 500 centimeter cube exchange of air. During physical activity, it goes up to 3.5, but there's always a 1.5 liter or 1500 centimeter cube residual air left in the lungs, so they're never completely empty or deflated. And normally our breathing rate is 12 breaths per minute, but during activity it can rise to 20 or even higher, right, to cope with the increased demand of oxygen. Now today we're going to talk about the process of ventilation, which is the physical intake of air and then removal of air from the lungs. So as mentioned, ventilation is, let's write that down, ventilation of lungs. And so that is the movement of air into and out of the lungs, right? Now, what is mentioned here is that the trachea, also commonly known as the windpipe, and the bronchi have these horseshoe, if you know how that is, so it's right, something like that. These horseshoe shaped hoops of cartilage. So cartilage is a tough material. It's not exactly bone, right, but it's a tough material that supports muscles, right? And so in the windpipe, right, assuming this is the windpipe, and you have these rings, right, horseshoe rings in the trachea, and then when they split into the bronchi, you have it in those as well. And what these do is that they provide physical support to these uh, right passageways for air, and prevents their collapse. So basically, right, them just just like sticking to each other and completely closing the passage of air, and then obviously that's going to cause suffocation. So it prevents their collapse. So physical support basically. All right, so there's cartilage there. The lung, right? There are no cartilages in the bronchioles, right? So,
What is a cartilage?
hmm?
What is a cartilage?
It is a tough material that supports muscles and is like okay. So it's as I mentioned, it's not exactly like bone. If you've ever, I mean, I can give you an example. If you ever had chicken, and sometimes in one of those juicy meaty pieces this is like this white type of rubbery type of thing attached to it. It's not exactly bone, but it's a bit flexible. Have you ever encountered that sort of stuff while having chicken?
Yes.
That's cartilage.
Okay.
Okay, so it is in terms of tissue, right? Cartilage is connective tissue, right? Okay. So, I mean, it's present in other parts of your body as well. It's present in joints, it's present in the rib cage, it's present in the nose as well, right? So, this like flexibility of your nose, that's bit of flexibility. There's bone as well, but there's cartilage as well in your nose. Okay, then talking about the lungs. So, the lungs do not contain any muscle fiber, right? And they expand and contracts simply due to the movement of the ribs and the diaphragm. Due to movement of ribs and diaphragm. Okay. So how does this work, right? It involves the obviously the diaphragm and the external and internal intercostal muscles. Right. Also, right? And the intercostal muscles are the ones present between the ribs. So it's like it's like a further explanation of how it works. It also involves external and internal intercostal muscles. Okay, now how does this work? So let's take a look at the process of inspiration. So there are two things happening in inspiration. First of all, the diaphragm muscles contract and pull the diaphragm down. Okay. And the second thing is that the internal intercostal muscles relax, the external intercostal muscles contract, and this causes the rib cage to move upward and outward. Okay. Now what this does is all of these movements of muscles and the rib and the diaphragm, what this does is it increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Now I'll share, right, uh, I'll put the illustration on screen as well as, I'll share a video. So it increases the volume of thoracic cavity, and what that causes is a drop in the pressure in the chest or the thoracic cavity, right? The pressure falls, the pressure falls below the external pressure of the air in, right, the environmental, the air pressure outside. And so because there's higher pressure outside, higher pressure of air outside, air moves into the lung. So we think like we're sort of sucking in air, which we can do voluntarily, but even so, right, there's this physical aspect of volume and pressure difference, and that allows the flow, right? So air moves into the lungs, right, and that inflates the lungs and the gas exchange and everything. So that's what's happening. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, then we talk about expiration. And in this, right, we can just reverse whatever happened over here. So the diaphragm muscles, right, they relax. And, right, they return to their dome shape. And then the intercostal muscles, so you reverse those as well. And so the internal intercostal muscles contract. The external intercostal muscles relax. And, right, the rib cage moves downwards and causes, right, expiration. It forces expiration. Forced expiration. Now, why is it forced expiration? Because in this case, what's happening is the volume of the thoracic cavity is decreasing. Or, simpler terms, the chest. The volume of the chest decreases. And what that does is that increases the pressure inside the chest, inside the lungs, compared to the air outside. And as we know, right, you're going to move from high pressure to low pressure. And so the air moves out of the lungs. And that is what's happening with each breath we take, right? Breathe in, breathe out. Those are the changes taking place. And if I just show you the illustration from the text, that will help. And then we'll also take a look at a video, right? So, right, this is right just showing you the rib and the sternum. The sternum is the wide bone in the center of your chest, right? And all the intercostal muscles. And then what? Here's the actual movement, right? So muscular movement is being shown here. This is inspiration. You can see that the volume is, greater. There's more space in the chest. These are what the ribs look like. They're expanded. And when it contracts, you can see the diaphragm is going back to its dome shaped. Over here, it's rather pulled and flat. So it's going back to its dome shape during expiration. The volume inside the chest is decreasing, and that's expelling the air, it's forcing the air outside. You can see with the ribs, right, much narrower and less space, right? So all of that works in you know in our breathing process. That's how it works. Now, also with this, I had video to share. So let me just get to that. Right, what this video shows is, as you can see over here on the previous page, it's a model to show how the lungs work, right? So this is a bell jar. They've got this tube with two balloons attached to it, and they've got this rubber sheet over here, uh, right, to mimic the diaphragm, and the bell jar is the chest, right? So obviously it's not going to be an exact replica, but what they're going to do is they're going to pull this rubber sheet down, which will increase the volume inside the bell jar, decrease the pressure, and you will see that the uh, right, the balloons will inflate. And when the diaphragm is, the rubber sheet is let go, it goes back. Now it's not arching upwards again because it's not an actual replica like a perfect model, but there will be a decrease in the volume inside, right, which increases the pressure, which causes the balloons to deflate because the air is moving out. So that's what we'll see in the video. Let me just put that up. Okay. Interestingly, this video is on Facebook. So there is no sound, and right, just a 5-second video. So you can see before I start the video, you can see the video, right?
Yes.
Okay. So before I start this, you can see that this rubber sheet, in this case, they have it like arching upwards and the balloons are completely deflated, right? And then when you see them pulling it down, it won't be like a very, the balloons won't inflate like we do in parties and everything, but you'll see movement. Ah, brilliant. All right, can you see that? So
Yes.
when he's pulling the rubber sheet down, you can see the balloons inflating, and then he's putting it back up, and so they're deflating. And that is how the lungs work. Any questions?
No.
Okay, with that, the final part of this chapter, and right, well, not the final part for our class, but just this chapter, because we do have time left and I would like to actually move on to the next. But before that, very briefly, right, how the gas exchange system is protected from pathogens and particles. So, right, there is a physical, defense system, physical defense against pathogens and particles. And this is, with respect to the gas exchange system. So particles like dust, right, or any other, particles that may enter your areas. Pathogens, what are pathogens? They are disease-causing organisms. They could be of various types, but we're, not talking about any particular type. We're just talking about them in general. So disease-causing, right, organisms. We'll talk about them more in chapter 11. And so, right, when we breathe in air, it has dust, it has bacteria or viruses or whatever, and there is a risk of infection or, dust particles accumulating and perhaps causing physical damage to the cells of our airways or something else, right? That there's those issues. And so there are two specialized types of cells in our trachea, right, or air passageways. Primarily the trachea, right? Some of the bronchi and, the bronchioles, right? So it's throughout, more so in the trachea and the bronchi. And one of them are called goblet cells. And they're called goblet cells because, you've got these cells, right, of the lining, and then you've got something like, this. It's it looks like, that. So its shape is like this drinking glass, not very good at this, right? Which is called a goblet. So they resemble that container, that glass type, and so that's why they're called goblet cells. And what these do is that they produce the substance called mucus, right? And mucus is this sticky liquid that, right, it forms a thin layer over the internal lining. Over the internal lining of the passageways, the air passages. It is a sticky liquid, and because of that, it's able to trap the pathogens and the particles and prevent them from moving, down into the lungs and, then the alveoli where they could cause harm or infection, right? Physical harm or infection, whatever the case may be. So, right, that's your defense mechanism. And along with those, you've got ciliated cells, right? So if I just draw them here, these are cells where like with these hair-like projections. Ciliated cells. right? And so they're also present in the epithelial lining along with the goblet cells. Oh, sorry, not epithelial lining of goblet cells, epithelial lining of the respiratory tract. That's another term that can be used, a more scientific term, right? And one that you would preferentially use to get your marks. So, respiratory tract. And so, right, the hair on these cells, this hair-like structure on these cells, they have a flicking motion. So, hair-like structures of these cells have a flicking motion, which basically means they're moving, like they're moving back and forth quickly, right? Like you flick your finger to sort of maybe remove an ant that's crawling over your hand or something, and you flick it away. So they have a flicking motion. What they do is that they move the mucus that is produced by the goblet cells upwards, right? So up the respiratory tract, right, towards the mouth, so to speak, right? And so when it reaches the top of the trachea, it is moved into the gullet, which is basically your esophagus, right? And this happens during normal swallowing. So you don't really feel it that much unless there's like thick mucus being produced in your trachea, maybe during infection or reaction to cold. And so obviously if it's going down your esophagus, it's going into your stomach, and then the mucus is digested because it does contain carbohydrates, does contain proteins, right? And then whatever particles or maybe microorganisms are there should be killed due to the acidic conditions in the stomach. And that brings us to an end of this chapter and talking about the human gas exchange system. Any questions?
No.
Okay, are you ready to move on to the next chapter then?
Yes.
Okay, so take a deep breath and we will start with chapter 10. And it's an easy chapter, right? It's a very easy chapter. It seems long, but the concept is very simple. Well, at least at the level of, O level. So I'm not going to go into the introductory details because you've, mentioned that so many times, and that's basically, right? Food is used to release energy, which is used to carry out, right, different and many functions, bodily functions. And they're listed at the beginning of the chapter, so I'm not going into that again. I'll just quickly read them out. So there's muscle contraction all over the body, like the peristalsis in your alimentary canal. There's the building up of proteins from amino acids. There's a process of cell division and cell replication and repair. There is active transfer for the movement of molecules. There's the growth of organisms, so new cells are formed and they increase in size. There's the transmission of electrical impulses by the nerve cells, and then the maintenance of a constant body temperature in warm-blooded animals such as ourselves, which is a process, uh, as part of the homeostatic system, which again we'll talk about later. So right? The primary food source that is used is glucose, and in the presence of oxygen, right? We know that glucose is a carbohydrate, and as the name suggests, it has carbon and hydrogen, right? And so what happens is the carbon and hydrogen are both oxidized in the presence of oxygen to make carbon dioxide and water, right? And release energy. So that is basically what respiration is, right? And this happens individually in all body cells. We came across the organelle, the mitochondria. That's where this happens, right? And so the number of mitochondria in different cells is different because it depends on how active they are, right? For example, muscle cells have more mitochondria. Why? Because when they contract, they need a lot of energy, right? Contraction of muscles. So muscle contraction requires a lot of energy. And so they've got more mitochondria to carry out more respiration, provide more energy. Now, this is not a single step process, it is a multi-step process, and those multi-steps are not part of your syllabus. You just need to know it's not happening in one go. And each step is catalyzed by enzymes. And so when we are talking about enzymes, in this case, because it's happening inside the cell, and the inside of the cell, the pH is neutral. And so what's really going to affect the rate of respiration is obviously the supply of oxygen, which we just talked about in human gas exchange, but temperature, right? So if the temperature is low, right, and the enzymes will not be functioning at optimum, and so respiration will be low. The rate of respiration will be low. If the temperature is at optimum or slightly higher, then they'll be functioning, at optimum rates. But if the temperature goes, unfavorably high, and so the rate of respiration will begin to decrease. And why does it begin to decrease? Because the enzymes start to denature. Why doesn't it stop all of a sudden? Because not all the enzymes denature altogether, right? So some enzymes denature and then others follow. And so it takes some time. Not all the enzymes denature together or at the same time. Right, but eventually you will come to a point where there is no respiration happening, and that basically means that the organism is dead, right? If it is due to increased temperatures. Any questions?
Mm.
Right now, I just killed off the organism entirely. It could happen in localized as well, right? For example, if your hand gets burned, those cells will die because they suddenly got like this huge temperature shock and they couldn't bear it, and so the skin At least the skin, if it's a superficial burn, will peel off and you'll get new skin. Why? Because the skin cells died because of the burn, right? uh, so yeah. Now, right, there are two types of respiration that take place in like take place not in the in the human body as well, but overall. The first is called aerobic respiration, right? And as the name suggests, aerobic means presence of oxygen. And so aerobic respiration is the release of a relatively large amount of energy by the breakdown of glucose in the you know in the presence of oxygen. And right, I mentioned that oxidation occurs. The carbon in the glucose molecule is oxidized to carbon dioxide. The hydrogen, the glucose molecule, is oxidized to water. And so once again, right, the equation for, right, you need to know this equation not only in words, but the molecular formulae as well. And I'll just put that. So, and the enzymes involved. And so you're getting carbon dioxide plus water and energy. In terms of their molecular formula, you've got glucose. So one molecule of glucose, you need to remember this, right? C6H12O6, that's glucose, plus 6O2. So the balanced equation is important because you will be asked, at least in the MCQs, if not in paper 2 as well, right? You need to know the balanced equations. And this is going to give you 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and then it's going to give you 2830 kilojoules of energy. And you need to remember this. Okay? Yes, it's pretty simple, at least, it's not a difficult equation. And this is all you need to know about aerobic respiration. That's it. Okay? Then the other type of respiration that occurs is called anaerobic. By the way, any questions?
No.
So this is what's happening in your body, in every cell of your body, every living part of your body, whether it be the muscles or the bones or the nails or the eyes or whatever, they all need oxygen. We're breathing, the human gas exchange, providing oxygen. And you can imagine, right? So when we have, like, when we are physically active, we need more oxygen. We start breathing more deeply. So oxygen is provided quick enough so that the glucose is oxidized quickly to release energy, and so, right, to provide for the demand of that physical activity that we're doing, right? But there comes a point where our breathing and the cell, the process of respiration just can't keep up with the demand of energy, right? And that's where we come into anaerobic respiration, right? So an means without, and so I mean respiration that's occurring without oxygen. And so what this is the release of a relatively small amount of energy from glucose uh, without, or from the breakdown of glucose to be more specific, without oxygen. So that happens in our muscles, right? Again, when you're doing exercise and the muscles need to a lot of energy, and breathing cannot keep up. It cannot provide enough oxygen. It cannot provide oxygen quick enough and in the amount that the muscles need, and so the muscles are contracting, they're active, and they need that energy. They don't have enough oxygen. What do? So they take a different route, right? The details are not in your syllabus at all, but basically what happens is that the glucose is converted to something called lactic acid, right? Now it can only keep up for a short time, right? Because if lactic acid keeps building up, it can cause harm, including muscle cramps, right? So lactic acid buildup in muscles can cause cramping, among other things. So what happens is that it is carried away in the blood to the liver, right? Where in the presence of oxygen, so obviously, right, you're not going to keep exercising and be deprived of oxygen for a long time. You're going to stop, and so you're going to stop that physical activity, and you're going to keep taking deep breaths, heavy breaths, and quick breaths, sorry, quick and heavy breaths. And so when oxygen supply is sort of restoring in the presence of oxygen, right, lactic acid is oxidized in the liver to carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released. So it doesn't go to waste, right? The body is, it's built to make the most of it. So later on, it is utilized when you get oxygen again. Now, the condition where your muscles and your body is sort of starving for oxygen, and that's why after exercise or any physical activity, you can, keep taking deep breaths for some time. That condition is called oxygen debt, right? Or there's a fancier name for this, which is excess post exercise oxygen consumption. Consumption, or EPOC for short. That's a fancier name. And basically what this does is, right, it continues until the shortfall of oxygen is covered, and then the body, so heavy breathing, heavy, quick, deep breathing continues after physical activity until normal body metabolic function is restored. Okay. And then just one last thing, right? So humans are not the only ones that have that utilize anaerobic respiration. Other microorganisms also utilize anaerobic respiration. An example of that is yeast. So yeast is a fungus, right? It's part of the fungi family. It is used in baking a lot, and in that baking, the anaerobic respiration that it carries out is exactly what it uses. So if yeast is put in anaerobic conditions, right, what happens is it takes that glucose and obviously have enzyme catalyzed reactions, and it converts that to alcohol, which is ethanol, right, and carbon dioxide. Now you might be wondering, well, there's no oxygen, so how are we getting carbon dioxide? There are ways of doing that in the body, but again, the particulars, because it's like sort of a detailed, step-by-step process, and that is you'll learn that in A level if you decide to take biology. And again, energy is released, but the amount of energy is obviously very low. So in the muscles, the energy released is only 118 kilojoules, right, as compared to the 2830 we had during aerobics. So it's very small, but it's something, right? Something's better than nothing. And so how is this, put to use for us, the anaerobic respiration of yeast? Well, when you mix it in the dough and you leave the dough, right, there's some oxygen, the yeast uses that oxygen, but then it becomes anaerobic and it converts it to alcohol and so this carbon dioxide, it causes dough to rise, right? And when you put it in the oven, the heat evaporates the alcohol, the ethanol, right? So there's none of it left. And when you eat it, you notice bubbles like sort of sometimes in the bread. Those are the like the not the air pockets, but the gas pockets where carbon dioxide was, right? So the carbon dioxide also evaporates in the heat. Well, not technically evaporate, but leaves the dough. It's expelled, and so those gas pockets where the carbon dioxide were right, those are represented by the bubbles that you can see in the bread, right? And as for yeast, it cannot utilize the alcohol, so that sort of goes to waste. Also, right, this process is also used in making industrial alcohol or ethanol. We'll talk about more about that in a later chapter. And obviously temperature is very important for yeast. So if you put yeast, like if you're using boiling water or very hot water when you're mixing the dough, the enzymes, right, will become denatured, and the yeast will not be able to utilize the glucose. It will starve and it will die, right? So something to keep in mind. And I believe, yeah, that's all. And we've covered chapter 10 as well, right? Chapter 10 is now done. Congratulations. Any questions?
No.
Okay. So the next time, inshallah, we'll talk about the circulatory system. Okay, transport in humans, chapter 11. All right.
Okay.
All right. See you next time, inshallah.
Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.